and you learn how people move. Are they running curved? Are they running, a full 20 yards all the time? Are they only running 5 yards? Are they running 12 yards? And whatever you start seeing patterns of how far people are running, then that's essentially how you set up your timing gates or your game or whatever it might be. So that's also just as important, because now you're starting to tie in what happens in the game to your actual play experience. So now, don't be afraid to put your timing gates at an angle where you're running a curve. Don't be afraid to work rundowns in. Don't be afraid to roll soccer ball out or where you're working there and then you go and sprint and take off.
That was Jarod Burton, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Lost Empire Herbs, and I want to share with you how to get a free bag of pine pollen through Lost Empire here today. Quickly first, I used to think herbs was just ginkgo biloba you got at the drugstore, but after being introduced to compounds such as the Phoenix formula through Lost Empire, I've been a regular consumer of Lost Empire herbs for over 4 years now. The Phoenix formula instantly changed my viewpoint on herbalism. I was literally buzzing with energy after my first dose. Within 2 weeks, I was noticing strength improvements in the weight room, and it's been fun expanding my herbalism regime to different things throughout the Lost Empire Herbs store. In Phoenix formula in particular, along with Shilajit, which is a very popular herb for strength and performance, you also have pine pollen, which is a superfood. It offers a variety of energy, health, and performance benefits. And you can grab that free bag of pine pollen with the modest cost of shipping by heading to justflypinepollen.com. If you want to check out other herbs that I enjoy through Lost Empire, you can head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly and grab 15% off your order. I can't recommend Lost Empire enough, and I really enjoy the fact that I've been able to partner with them through this podcast for as long as I have. So be sure to check that out. Let's get on to the rest of the show. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm excited to welcome back to the show Jarod Burton. Jarod is a performance specialist, a chiropractic student, and a health coach. Jarod got his coaching start working with Brady Volmering, who I recently have had on the show, working with DAC baseball. He spent his recent years coaching, consulting, and running educational courses in the private sector. Jarod was on the podcast a little over a year ago. And in that podcast, he spoke a lot on work capacity development and really rethinking the way we look at work capacity in light of how we perceive our environment, what our belief systems are, and adding pieces of that biopsychosocial structure or hierarchy into work capacity. And within that conversation, we were also talking about the role of perception in speed training. And that's actually something that I wanted to get a lot more into. We didn't have time for it to really expand on that in the last podcast. So we will on this one. We'll be getting a lot into the role and the interplay between our environment and our speed outputs, how to design speed training sessions based off of our environment and the specific elements of the game. We'll be talking about some differences in training versus competition, the role of play and exploration relative to outputs. We'll be talking about variability and randomness in training and much more. I'm excited to get you guys this podcast here again. Jarod Burton back on the show. Let's get to episode 378. Jarod, it's great to have you back on the show, man. I know last time you were on the podcast, I believe we got a little bit into some perception and speed-based stuff, like how, for example, how an athlete sprints when just sprinting versus having a frisbee thrown or being chased, and then like the repeatability of those things versus just doing it for a timing gate or maybe just sprinting as fast as you can or to a percentage. So I'm kind of getting long-winded here, but I'm curious what got you started in considering the role of environment on training, on speed, on how we display athleticism.
Yeah. So what got me started on that, I talked previously in other podcasts how DAC baseball, Brady Volmering, we were out at a facility in Missouri, and the amount of athletes that we had grew. So then we had to bring on somebody else. And so we ended up hiring on a guy, Brett Adams from Transcending Performance. And he did a lot more with like small-sided games and skill work. And I was in more of the weight room side. But I knew that he would be a good fit. So we brought him on. And then I just started seeing how he would interact with players or our athletes, and how he would structure workout sessions was completely different than you would ever think of. Like, it wasn't just, okay, we're going to get underneath this barbell. There was started to be game set up, and so I thought this was really interesting because everything that my background is high velocity, high volume, a lot of that Schroeder stuff where you're doing everything as fast as you can, and you're doing it in a ideal position, whatever that perfect position means. And at that moment, I realized that I never thought about what that looks like on the field when people are actually participating. Because I was always on the assumption that, well, if you train a muscle how to, do its job, whether it's just to flex or extend, then that's going to carry over into sport. But then I quickly realized that there's the whole concept of transfer training. It's a lot more complex than that. So that's where I first got into it. And then there was a very interesting article that I came across that was on breath work. And they use breath and fear to basically figure out how fast neurons were firing inside the body. And so they found that when somebody was nasal breathing, the neurons inside of their brain and their body would fire faster. And if they started mouth breathing, it would fire slower. And they noticed that when individuals would get into like a fear state, like if they showed them like a tragic image or did some sort of fright or something, people would go into this mouth breathing. So automatically everything started slowing down. So then that article then also progressed me a little bit further and going into, okay, well, there's something here. If I'm looking for high velocity, if I'm looking for speed, if I'm looking for how fast an athlete processes a situation, then if there's something that startles them, then that's going to leave them susceptible to injury. So then that's when I got into, okay, well, then how can we get more into the perception and action now to reduce injuries, essentially?
Yeah, it's considering those emotional layers, I think is really helpful. It was interesting. There was a lot of, I don't know how 100% related this is, but there was a little bit of buzz going on social media about Texas Christian and Colorado were playing each other, and apparently some of the Texas Christian players were cramping at the end of the game. And it's Mark McLaughlin, who's been on this show, had put an infographic on how cramping is multifactorial. It's not just because what was being put out there was, this is related to the strengthening. There's blame being thrown at the strength and nutrition staff. And an infographic Mark had put had shown that there's like emotional load. Like, is this that can factor in? There's a lot of things that can factor in. The emotion that's present in the game, or it can play impact into the physiology as well. So who knows exactly, but with the specifics there. But I just find it interesting. I always look at that, and I think that especially when you're talking about things like fear and safety, or finding yourself in a flow state and being able to move there, I think there's a lot, and it makes you think too about, this goes back to our last podcast where we were talking about like just how much you can do, like your physical workload limits. And when we look at just how much an athlete runs and sprints and moves in a game versus like just a typical workout, like, hey, go sprint and do plyometrics, it can be a lot different. And so, thinking about how some of those emotions might play into that and how you feel after the game, or even, it was funny with Colorado too. I know, Travis Hunter plays both sides of the ball, and they interview him after the game, and he's like excited after, his player load is like crazy, insanely high. But he's like, I'm ready to go again, and you think about how much does that internal emotional state play into that can maybe go a little bit beyond just a typical data point.
Yeah, I know that's huge. And that's actually a really important point. And on the strength side, when we would do weight room training, one of the things that I would always look for athletes to do essentially was to cramp. Because once we get them to the point of cramp, we've reached their tolerance point, and then they have to continue to hold that position to work through the cramp. So that was a physiological aspect. From an emotional aspect, if the game's not going the way that you're choosing for it to go, or you desire for it to go, athletes will shut down, and they'll basically create a way out. I don't like how the situation's going. So, and it's subconscious programming that they're doing that they don't realize, but they're saying, okay, I'm looking for a way out. And then the body cramps. Something bothers them and their body cramps. So we see it on whether you're doing perception action or if you see it in the weight room. I mean, it is a real thing. It does occur.
Yeah. So when it comes to how you're framing this up for a training session, so like running athletes through a speed session or something related to repeat efforts as related to sport or anything like that. I mean, speed, I guess, is an easy one just because it's pretty straightforward. If we're talking about how we're putting the environment together and perception, what factors are you considering, Jarod, when it comes to that? Like, what are some of the big things you're looking at athletes coming into a training session, how they're perceiving the session, how they're perceiving the work? What are some big things you're looking at there?
Yeah. Well, the very first concept to grasp is building a relationship with the athlete. And what that means to me is that the athlete is empowered and they have the freedom to be their true, authentic self. And that doesn't mean that they need my permission to have that freedom. It means that they have come to that old autonomy where they can be their true, authentic self. And so typically what that looks like is there's a discussion on the first day, and this discussion also continues out. But it allows for the athlete to essentially clear all fears. What are you, where do you struggle on the field? Where do you feel like, you're always beat? Where is the position that you're afraid that if you get into, something might happen, or somebody hits a backhand over to this corner? Do you lose confidence here? Is it a left-handed pitcher? Is it a right-handed batter? Is it a slider? Whatever it might be for any sport. And so you essentially clear those things out on the table where they're telling you where they feel like they fail. And a lot of times more than what you'll find is that those areas that they failed, there's usually a past trauma that has occurred there. Where, let's say they got double teamed or something and they were brought over to a corner, they lost the ball somehow, and the next thing you know, the coach was ripping into them, or they felt like they let their teammates down. So then there's a pre-trauma that occurred, then that sets up the next time that situation occurs, the body essentially will freeze. And so that's why it's extremely important to get all that clearing out, because you're allowing the athlete to just let go and essentially vent of any sort of past traumas that might have occurred. And once they're able to do that, then you're able to have a good, strong foundation that allows you to just continually engage with the athlete, where they continually clear and all this stuff. An example of this would be when I was working with at the facility, we had a group of seniors, and when you have seniors who've already committed to Division I schools, and you come in with an exercise program and say, okay, we're going to do isometrics or something. They all looked at me like, why am I going to just hold this body position? Like, I just spent my last 4 years building myself, and I made the person who I am. So why would I change my workout program? Fair enough question, I believe. And so there was a lot of pushback that would go, okay, how do we work together to make sure you get what you feel like you needed, because this is how you build yourself, but then also how do we trust each other? And so that is an example for me for how they continue to clear, and we continue to talk, okay, I'm doing these isometrics, but my lift numbers are going down, my sprint numbers are going down, so I don't think your program's working, so now what? And so they just always have the confidence and the clarity to be able to say, I don't like how this is going. I don't think this is working for me. What can we do different? So that is always, for me, the foundation. It's the most important, is that there always needs to be clear communication. And once that's laid down, I think your original question was going back to how I structure a session, to say.
Yeah, like within the session itself.
Yeah. So then within the session, once let's say if we're doing the perception action, once you realize what they're afraid of, essentially that's the scenario that you need to create. So, and this is just the things that I learned from Brett Adams. And I mean, we got great results. And there's other ways that we can get into talking about this too. But in essence, a lot of people, when they get into the perception and action, they lose track of that there's a purpose behind what you're doing. Because regardless of what you're doing, the athlete should always know how to tie that specific scenario back to their sport. So when you're creating an environment, it can vary. I'll talk about the one specific at the moment about once you realize, or once the athlete tells you what their fears are, or the positions or the situation that causes them that fear, that where they're timid, they get the deer in the headlights. That's essentially the situation that you want to recreate. So what that would mean then is, if a batter, if he's like, okay, I'm afraid of lefties. Okay, well then that means that he's getting live at bats versus a lefty. If it's okay, well I don't feel good when I'm double teamed and I'm pinned into a corner. So then you're going to create a game that forces them to be in that position where they have to figure out, okay, do I have to then do a route where I'm going to try and curve around these guys? Am I going to pass the ball? How am I going to maneuver myself? One of the situations that I did, I'll talk about the lacrosse player. So there was a lacrosse player that when I asked him, he felt that he was always beat anytime that he felt like he had to rotate his body. So he was a goalie, and anytime that he felt like he got crossed up and he would start moving one direction and then he had to rotate back to try and get to stop the ball, he always felt like that he was beat. And so what we did is we went to a football and we started to work on different routes where I would purposely throw a ball behind him where he'd have to rotate back behind. We worked on some mat work where he was on his knees. So like a progression of he's on his knees, he's working to rotate, and then from going to stand up and learning to rotate. But then also with that too, one of the best things that you can always, when it comes to fear, is that you have to do the specific situation. So there is like a gradual buildup, but always the end goal needs to be as identical as you can get it to the sport. So even though we started with the football and throwing back behind him and forcing him to rotate in these awkward positions, it needs to be like we finished with using an actual lacrosse ball, lacrosse stick, and a goal, and working that way and forcing him to, okay, combination. Okay, well, maybe we'll do a few reps with the football. Maybe we're going to do a few reps with the lacrosse ball. But that's ultimately the end goal there. Another environment you can do, which is also important, is that regardless of what the sport is, so if somebody plays baseball and you set up the gator ball or something like that, you want to make sure that they know that specific event ties back to their sport. And so an example with that is when we were playing gator ball, we'd have two small cones to say on or not cones, but goals, like mini soccer goals. And the athletes had to work up and down the goal to try and force themselves to score. However, there's 4 cones in the middle, which prevented any person from running through the middle of the field. Everybody had to essentially run on the outside, so they had to run slants. So they essentially had to go straight and then curve either right or left towards the goal in order to be able to score. After playing the game, you ask the athletes, okay, what, is there anything that you like to change? How does this apply to your sport, etc. And one of the cool things about watching film during that situation was that without the athletes, without our baseball players actually even knowing it, every single time that they would round a curve to head towards the goal, they would treat it as if they were rounding a bag. So that was a great way for them to then realize, okay, this is how this sport or this activity, this small-sided game relates to my sport, where now I'm learning how to actually round at second base. I'm learning how to actually learn to, take a hard turn out of, going from first to second. I know how to round that and get the best angle. And so there's different examples there, but both of them are extremely important, where either you're looking at the fear for it to be exactly how the situation occurs in the game, or you're looking for it to be where your environment is created where subconsciously they don't necessarily recognize what's going on until after. They can start piecing it together. And then if that athlete pieces together, then they can start progressing it. So now, like in the game, we can throw out a base on the say, like there's an actual base, like treating it like turning like a double play to say, or maybe we're looking how to work with first base, etc. However that might be.
What do you think, Jarod, about, I guess you could say like the general side of things, in the sense of, you could say a football player who goes to do track season, which is speed, that without the perceptual stimuli of a football game, or even just general, you could just say just general training for the sake of general training, as well as I think too about, I think it's called like coyote teaching, or the idea of like a Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid, where he had him doing something that actually, like when he was washing the fence, he had no idea that it was relating to the thing, but it was kind of tricking him into getting the motion. So it's like you're actually putting the motions into, and you could say too with something like that, like a Karate Kid, where you're doing the motion, but it's still tied to meaning. Watching, where you're cleaning or painting a fence, or you're doing a job, but it's, maybe you could say it's also not tied yet to the emotional stress of fighting someone yet. You know, that maybe could be a way of putting it. So I'm curious what your take is on, and I say that as well in light of, I get in our modern sports landscape where it's like, where everything is specific and people play the same sport, they specialize very early, and it's all that sport. And sometimes I think, sometimes you think, well, if you can't beat the system, is there other ways that you could perhaps take people away from the same stressors of their sport in the general portion of the training? Obviously, at some point, if you want to get better, you need to tie things into specific or specificity. But from a general perspective, where athletes might be doing those things under a different emotional stress, like they're playing a game where they are replicating some of the movements, maybe not all of them, but it's still overall a good training load. And basically, what are your thoughts on the idea of having athletes do something with no specificity, but they're doing the same thing and they're having fun? I guess you could say you're tricking people into doing certain movements. Any thoughts on like that kind of Karate Kid, wash the fence mentality for something that might transfer later?
Well, there's a couple things that you actually mentioned that I want to touch on too, and going back to the track athletes too, is one of the things that I've learned with track athletes is, it's, from what I saw in my experience, it was just, if not more important, to have them play those games, or to, with like timing gate systems, you're implementing a lot of variables, whether that might be they're chasing a soccer ball, somebody's chasing them. Another thing that we would do is we would have people work, we would set up timing gates and have people work through pickles. Pickles as in baseball, when you get into like a rundown and you get caught between the rundown and you're running back and forth. And so we created scenarios like that, where that was set up where, you know, you could get their times with the timing gate, recovering a fumble, grappling work beforehand, whatever it might be. But there's different ways that we would use an external focus in order for them to run faster. And that was, for me, just like more profound for a track athlete who's only supposed to run a certain distance. And if you want to control things in games or whatnot, I mean, you can always put a time to it. So whatever their goal is for, okay, I'm going to complete my X run or my X sprint in 10 seconds or, you know, a minute and something, then that becomes the time interval for what you're working. And so then they learn, okay, essentially they're learning how to move and coordinate and play and under those time restraints as well. So there's a lot of different variables that you can do there. That's especially, and I also see that too, that it works really well with athletes coming off of an injury. I had a softball player, and you know, she went everywhere. Her like a top prospect for the state, and you know, they were pretty concerned. Okay, does she need to get surgery? Does, you know, she's not getting better? And one of the very first things that I realized working with her is that every time she would throw a softball, her arm hurt. But if she threw a football, her arm didn't hurt. So what we ended up working with is we basically had her throwing with a football, and we would create different games where she was using a football, and then we would go to a baseball, and then we would go back to a softball, and we would throw the softball. And then as soon as she says, okay, my arm's starting to hurt again, then we go back to a football, and we would just continue to blend all this stuff and through different games. And it got to the point where within a month, she wasn't able to throw one pitch, and she was throwing over 100 pitches pain-free. And so that was just, and we kept always upping the stimulus. So it first started just as a game where we just because we just started out, we went out to the baseball field, and all we did to start was we just ran around in essentially random areas, just throwing a football back and forth, just moving. And then we would go into more specific. Okay, well, now you're fielding, because she also played third base if she wasn't pitching. So then we went to a little bit of that, and then we would go into her actually pitching, and then anytime her arm started hurting, we would stop with the pitching. We would set up a game. We'd play the game. Pain goes away, and then we go back to the pitching, and we just kept blending the two over and over again until the point where she could just throw as much as she want. Didn't matter what pitch either. It wasn't just fastballs. She would throw all of her pitches and make sure that she was pain-free. So there's also that component that I think is just as good.
Yeah. Today's podcast is sponsored by TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr is an online software for coaches and trainers, and I've continued to hear great things about the TeamBuildr platform. If you're looking for either an in-house training portal for your training groups or an online training hub, be sure to check out the TeamBuildr training software. That's something that I really am interested in. I'm interested in a lot of facets of training, but framing up, and I know we've had this conversation before, but the idea of exploration, like explorative work, play-based work, and then dialing into, on the other side of the spectrum, dialing into outputs and training sessions that, be it a training session or even a training block, or like you said, an athlete who's coming off of an injury, or you could even say an athlete who maybe has like burnout or something. How do you arrange things? And I think so often we only look at things, or training is only looked at on the level of sets and reps and a very high specificity in biomechanics. But at the end of the day, sometimes athletes just need to play and do so with a different, a little different implement. And then you can transform that into the specific element of the output. Or even I think about, there's Jeremiah Flood who talked about, you mentioned Gator Ball, but playing, and Jake Turum may have said something about this, maybe he was there, but they would play Gator Ball and then go do a 10-meter fly sprint or something like that, and then go play more Gator Ball and do a 10-meter fly sprint, and they were running really fast times, or I think maybe they were personal best times. And I've seen that just coming off of, if we just do pick up soccer for the warm-up, then I've seen kids go from, with the first few sessions, we do a 20 timed and they run their time, and then we warm up with pick up soccer and they run 0.2 faster doing that as a warm-up. And it's just like, there's a lot of power in here, and there's a lot of things I think where you can really use that and unpack that. But I'm curious too, based off what you had said with the softball player example and throwing the football, arranging. And I will say one other thing too with that, it reminds me of, it makes you think of how much of that was mental and how much was the very specific throwing pathway. I know DJ Murakami had talked about a client who was doing like deadlifts with a sandbag and was like, I can't do deadlifts, my back, I can't do this. But just prior, she had been doing a clean and press with the sandbag. So she was deadlifting, but it's like, as soon as the word deadlift comes out, it's like, psychosomatic, I can't do this, and it makes me think of how much of that type of thing is mental versus actually physical, or some whatever combination. Anyways, I was definitely curious for you to go a little bit more into a training session and how that can unfold on the level of starting with play, starting with exploration, and then how that can transform into outputs. Or maybe if you're starting on outputs and it's not going very well, being like, all right, let's turn this into something that's more play or exploration based. I'm curious how those three pieces rotate around in your training sessions, or how you can see them as variables that can be manipulated?
Yeah. I will go, I'm going to share something on what you just said real quick for a minute. So another component, I mean, we've talked about how I'm in chiropractic school, and I also do acupuncture with that as well. Germany is probably one of the leading, I guess, modern of putting the most amount of research and science behind acupuncture. And even to practice acupuncture in Germany, you have to be medically licensed, and so there's a lot of research behind that. If a medical doctor is saying, this is the only way that you can be an acupuncturist. So anyway, where I'm going with this is that they were able to find pain memory points. And so with auricular therapy, which means in the ear, if a person came in with pain, one of the protocols that you would clear was that you would hit the pain memory spots. And essentially you're clearing that energy that's stuck in those fields, because our body is made up of electricity. Our bones are made up of crystals. Our muscles are made up of water. Jared Pollock's research in Veda Austin at the University of Washington have showed that water holds memory. And so our muscles aren't just, some Russians would say their muscles are just stupid. That's not the case. They actually hold intelligence. And so that's extremely important when you're going into a training session, and also confirms that, with what they found in acupuncture, that there are these pain memory points that when an event happens, the body holds on to that emotion. And so you have to release that. So I'll go on to the question now, but I do think that's really cool.
Yeah.
Now with the question, one of the things that you can, whether you're looking at changing it with how the field is set up, like how the structure is, if you're looking at what objects you're going to use for, balls, are you going to use a weight, or you're not going to use a weight? Those are all things that you need to consider. And so, and also I don't remember if I talked about this on the previous podcast as well, but also how you set up the environment. If you make, sometimes when we would run our, let's say, flying tens or accelerations, we would set up in an area where everything looked super closed off. So what we were able to do is because we were inside of a baseball facility, we were able to put down nets that would essentially make the play area look smaller. And if the play area looks smaller, then you perceive as you can achieve more distance faster, because it looked, and then if you take that same 10 yards and you move up the screen and they got this long, 200 feet of open space, now all of a sudden their eyes are, looking way far out. So now this, same thing that was 10 yards now looks like 30 yards. And so that was one way that you can change perception of changing how closed off the environment looks, and if there's backgrounds and all that stuff, because that's going to influence, okay, this looks like, because it's so closed off, I can literally take 2 steps and I've run 10 yards. Oh my gosh, now it looks like I have to run like, marathon, to run 10 yards because of how open the field is. So that was one way. I mentioned the rundowns. With this, what I think is also very important is that you look at your sport and you understand the dimensions of the sport. So this would be where you're talking to the actual, I don't know, football coach or skill coach, or you can even Google all these dimensions, but you understand the dimensions of the basketball court, the tennis court, the football court. And then you also watch and you learn how people move. Are they running curved? Are they running, a full 20 yards all the time? Are they only running 5 yards? Are they running 12 yards? And whatever you start seeing patterns of how far people are running, then that's essentially how you set up your timing gates or your game or whatever it might be. So that's also just as important, because now you're starting to tie in, what happens in the game to your actual play experience. So now, don't be afraid to put your timing gates at an angle where you're running a curve. Don't be afraid to work rundowns in. Don't be afraid to roll soccer ball out, or, where you're working there and then you go and sprint and take off, or the grappling work, or getting up from the ground, or rolling, or whatever it might be. So that's, and if you're, are you looking for any more specific examples than that? But that's just the framework, the general of multitude of different factors of what we would use.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense with I've seen, and I haven't gone too far to this, but I know with like Tony Holler, Track Football Consortium, and Chris Corfist, and the football piece there. I didn't go to the football presentations when I spoke at those. It would have been interesting for sure. But I believe that there was coaches using timing gates in conjunction with like specific routes and patterns and things that people were doing at practice, and that makes a lot of sense, and especially from that specificity element of things. I think that, and probably more if we're looking at meaning. I think I really, to me, I think the big thing is meaning, because that is inherently, instantly, extremely meaningful. Running a 10 or a 20, just running that and getting a time on its own linear, somewhat meaningful. Obviously, you want to beat your time, you want to get better. If you have a record board or a leaderboard in real time, probably becomes even more meaningful. If you get a band or something for running a particular time, even more meaningful, and I think a lot of it does come back to the meaning aspect of things. At the same time too, like if it's general and you want to take a break from the specificity of your sport, well, that's why track season is just naturally great. It's all there. I don't know if you have any further things to mention with that. I do think something you said was interesting with the way the space is and the way the athlete perceives it and the visual element. I've seen research on, I'm trying to remember the exact what the exact parameters were with this, but it was something like they had different people look at a flight of stairs even. This is just general population. And they had them estimate the steepness of the stairs. And basically people who were, I don't know 100% how related this is, but people who were in better physical condition, or maybe it was their stress level, would rate the stairs to be not as steep. And the people who were in less good a physical condition or higher stress would say the stairs were steeper than they actually were. And I mean, to me, I just say that because it's just interesting that, research shows that there's this very strong link between our own abilities and how we perceive the environment. And then it's very reasonable to say things could very quickly and easily work the other way around with how you perceive the environment and what ends up being in your physical outputs, or even too your fear or safety of the environment. How comfortable are you in this environment? And I think that's where you really get into the game speed pieces too. How quickly and easily and comfortable are you moving in the game? So me saying that now, I'm kind of like forgetting about the back to like the very specific routes, finding specific distances and things like that. The follow up actually I have for this one, and if there's anything you have with that, is there anything you want to add to that? Because I do have a follow up.
Yeah, just briefly, the track and field is really the only one that has the specific metrics of what you're going to run, and so my recommendation would be, even if you're doing football or baseball, to not get fixated on what you have to, like the distance you have to run. Don't be afraid to have your background data be 5 yards or 15 yards or 12 yards outside of the norm of the 10 and the 20. Because a lot of time what we find in sports is that most people are not running a 10 yard. It's more of they're working between 12 and 18 yards, or maybe you're only working for the first 5 yards. So to be comfortable with, just because the strength and conditioning standard is that we're going to run a flying 10 or a 10-yard acceleration or 30 or 40, whatever it might be, it's okay to be more specific than that. And that's what I would recommend. That's what I saw that produced the best results. But then also too, like I said, understanding the dimensions of the field. Running bases, you have 90 feet. So make sure that you work with 90 feet. If you're going to work with running from first to second, then that doubles. So then you learn to work with that distance. But just keeping in mind those dimensions of the field.
Yeah. So my thought with what you were saying, just with things that were specific, and this going a little bit to the non-specific, and not specific, but I should say not as measurable. And maybe this is a thing too, where I think sometimes when you have things that are measured, it can, and measured and predictable in the sense of, hey, we're going to do this distance today. Sometimes, and maybe, and if you say we're doing this distance and this amount of reps, which I think is a good thing. But I think at the same time, if we think about flow states, and we think about sport, and I know Frank Frencich has said this about nature, is in nature, you don't know how far you're running. You might be chased and you have no idea. And I think that there is something to be said about like a flow state of being in the present moment, of having uncertainty. Because it does force you can't think about, okay, I got this many more and I'm done, or, or maybe I hope my time is this on this one. You are more in the moment and you're processing. And I was thinking about, one thing I was thinking about, even as you were, talking about some of the points that you were mentioning, was when I was, with the uncertainty, one of the best or the most athletic, at least this, most generally athletic in the sense of being able to like jump really high, dunk really well. The sad thing is I still went through this basketball season and only scored like, it's funny looking back, I thought I scored like 11 or 12 points a game my senior year of high school. And I only scored like, my parents dug up the stat line and I only scored like 7. I was like, oh man, I thought I was better than that. It's like some heuristic where you think you're better than you really were. So, in terms of basketball specific stuff, I would have needed a lot more of what you're talking about. For me, it was more like, oh, well, I could at least jump, really high and dunk well, which was that was more my goal in so many ways anyways, which maybe is telling of the 7 points a game instead of like 12 or 15. But we would do a lot of just wind sprints, change of direction, fast change of direction, running lines, hit the free throw line and run back, hit the midcourt line and run back. A lot of racing. The coach would always tell me I was the fastest guy on the team and make me race the point guard. But he would never say, and I don't think this happens in like, basketball or a lot of typical team conditioning. It was just start running lines. And when the coach decides you're done, you're done. You don't know when you're going to be done. You don't know how many more you have to do. And it was just interesting because I did that kind of training for, I don't know how long. I mean, it was kind of in and out with how intense that focus was, but I would say it was at least 3 or 4 weeks where we were doing that type of work hard enough where I wasn't going and lifting weights in my basement, a few times a week after practice, like I often did. That was just so much. But at the end of all of it, I was able to, I probably mentioned this on the last podcast we did, but like basically do 15, 20 minutes of sprints after practice that were hard, shake my legs out, have the capacity and ability to go up then and jump and touch my highest 3 inches over the top of the square, the backboard, and catch alley-oops or close to it where my head was close to the rim. Like just felt like I was Superman rocketing off the ground. And it was the product of something that actually wasn't formally measured. The meaning was race the other players and you should be faster than this, Joel. And I didn't know how many I was doing. And I mean, it was interesting to consider all that. These days too, I think there's something powerful in change of direction and a lot more things in change of direction type sprinting that I didn't know about in the past. But it was just interesting to think about that. So long-winded story to ask your take on when it's the more like nature, like when you don't know how many or you don't know how far. If there's any thoughts you have on any sort of training ideas like that.
Yeah. And I use more of that within the weight room than I did on the field, to say, because no, maybe not. There is a time for sure, especially when you're doing long duration isometrics or you're doing things where they're doing thousands and thousands of reps of one specific thing. There's that from the mental aspect of, well, it doesn't really matter how many reps I do. I'm just looking for, how would I phrase this? For the athlete, what I'm looking for them is not necessarily to be focused on the stopwatch or be focused on the reps. I'm looking for them, regardless of the external focus, for them to be able to put 100% into every single rep. And so, because a lot of times people get focused on the time or the reps and they'll say, okay, all right, now I know I need to, I can kind of coast a little bit halfway through here and then, finish strong. So then I can, rep out as fast as I can for the last, I don't know, 10 reps or something like that. So if they don't have an end goal, or there's no time, there's no reps, every single rep is their own accountability to say of how much intention, how much effort do you want to put into that specific rep. Field work, that might be more for grappling. It could be for the sprinting. I mean, I think it applies. But I think that just goes back to the idea of the athlete having the freedom and the autonomy and being able to just feel like they can run. Like if they want to run, go for it. But also too, putting them in the constraints, understanding that there are dimensions in the field, like the sports we do play have those. So that is something that we do have to keep in mind.
If you're in the world of sports performance, you've probably heard of jump testing mats. These mats use hang time to measure total jump height or contact time to measure quickness abilities off of the ground. The best jump mat that I've come across also happens to be a sponsor of this show, which is the Plyomat. The Plyomat is not only accurate, easy to use, and affordable, but it also allows you to string multiple mats together to add an extra dynamic to plyometric testing and training. To check out the Plyomat, you can head to plyomat.net. That's plyomat.net. Yeah, I think there's just, rather than framing it of, oh, what's superior, I think there's just benefits of both. And I think that ultimately, if you're going to be the best you can be in a skill, there needs to eventually be some level of constraining towards the direction you want to go in terms of more concrete work. But I think for myself too, I was someone who was I started training myself, like lifting weights in the basement when I was like 11 and, thinking about sets and reps and training arrangements. And I think in some ways there's almost maybe athletes who, if you're too much like that, if you're too quantitative, you almost need a burst of that, like a little randomness and a little to get used to stay in the moment. Versus trying to think. Richard Eschavis, he had called it, I think he had approached training from the mental, my memory is so bad, but one of the ones was strategizing. So it's like there's I know at least two of them. One was just you are interfacing with the workout emotionally, and then another one was you are strategizing the workout. Like if it's I think his reference is like a CrossFit workout where it's like, all right, I got this and I got this and I got this. So here's how much effort I'm going to put here. Here's how much effort I'm going to put here, where it's a mental construct. You are mentally assessing your training versus actually getting in and emotionally interfacing with it. And the way to do that is when you don't know, you don't know what's coming. You don't know how many you have to do. And on top of that too, there's a high quality demand. I think it's one thing if a coach has an athlete's doing a bunch of wind sprints and it's like, and there's no like I've had workouts with basketball where it's like, just do a bunch of wind sprints and they're all at a relatively low intensity and just surviving it till the coach says you're done. But within that, there's very little intensity, meaning any sort of specificity. I know the example I gave before, the coach was always having me like race the other players. And I think for me, that training might have hit me differently than other players who weren't being told that they were the fastest player on the team. They should be faster than this, et cetera, et cetera. I would say that's a big part of it. It kind of makes me think almost a way you could possibly do it. And this is where my track brain comes out, is there was a cross-country coach at my university, Cedarville University, where I went, who he was an older guy when I was there. I think he was in his 60s or 70s. So you could say old school, but I think part of being quote unquote old school, there's a lot of bad, over conditioning, you could say, practices that came with that. But there's also, I think, a lot of creativity, just because a lot of those coaches didn't have a manual. And one thing this coach did was for the cross country team, he called it lottery runs. And I remember someone telling me about this workout when I was there, and I was like, it made no sense to me when it was being explained. It was like, basically you run a 400 at a certain pace, and then the coach flips a coin while you're running. And then if it's heads, you have to run another lap. If it's tails, you don't. And I almost wonder, to me, part of it, I would think I would almost want to start. I don't know, I guess you could really do this anywhere. It could morph into anything, but part of me would think almost of starting with more work like that when you're doing speed work, just to make sure whatever is done is being done in the moment. And then maybe you have more, outside of getting your mileage in, your solid base mileage in early, maybe it becomes more structured later on. I don't know. This is my mind kind of going, but I just think that it is an interesting thought to look at how an athlete tends to process a training. Are they strategizing? Are they very overly mental, cerebral? How do they interface with it emotionally? And then finding ways to dig into that versus absolutely every single thing being, all right, this many sets, this many reps, this amount of time. Again, not that I don't think that there's a good, solid, overarching time and place for that. Because I know that's also been a helpful part of my own training background, is doing just, hey, we're going to go run 7/200s tempo. It's a recovery day. It's also elasticity. And my goal mentally was to do each of those as relaxed and easy as possible. And I think that was helpful too. Anyways, I kind of rambling a little bit. Just if you have anything with that, I'm certainly curious.
Yeah, the variability is really important. You talked about, the nature. In nature, there's a lot of variables. Some people would say they're randomness, or some even, I think the physics word is stochastic. It's randomness. And that is, I've found that to be just as beneficial. That there was a guy I was working with, and he mentioned that he was a power lifter, if not a power lifter, power lifter. And so he would lift huge amounts of weight, and he got the most amount of gains when he would actually, okay, today I'm only going to squat at 70%. Tomorrow I'm going to squat at 85. Third day I'm going to do 52%. Fourth day I'm going to go 98%. Sixth day I'm going to go 92%. And essentially varying that is how he got his biggest strength gains. And I think that can be just as beneficial in a sport game, or if you're playing something with training, is always changing a slight degree of a variable, whether it's the angle's different of a football throw. That's like, you're not doing the same thing over and over again, or you're in the weight room and a slightly different angle of, how you would do a press or something like that. All those different variables are going to make you stronger. They're going to make you faster. And the way that I think about it is that the more variability that you see, the more that you can predict the outcomes. And that's important when you're on the field, is that most people get stuck in situations, or they freeze, is because they're put into a situation that they've never experienced before. Or when they did, the first time they experienced and it didn't go well, then they were screamed and yelled at. And so now they have a trauma behind that. And so it is important that when you are in practicing, or you're in the training sessions, is that you're doing those different things so the athletes continue to see different things. And then once they feel like I've tried everything, then that's when it's extremely important for then you as a coach who recognizes maybe something they haven't tried before, and then you go and perform that real quick. And then now they can see a whole new way, or they can see like, wow, why didn't I think of that before? And so that's just as important, I do believe. And it's funny you mentioned that with the lottery. I grew up with, they called it the deck of death. And so you'd have 52 cards, and they would flip up a card. And, if it was clubs, you're doing push-ups. If it was hearts, you're running, suicides, if, et cetera, whatever you want it to be. But so there's that component as well.
Yeah. The card deck, it is funny because it's like this. It makes me think of like the college dorm room, where like that's what the guys would, hey, you want to do a card deck push up, like something like that. You just think of it as this, I don't know, I guess fun like bro thing to do with the card deck and different types of push ups with whatever came up. But it's funny. I got a book by the late Bud Jeffries, who's a really well known like strong man, and he was in martial arts and a lot of movement practices, and he had a little bit different way of thinking about things. But he would his workouts would be like, he would list like work up to, it would be something like do 6 singles with a heavy weight, and then your cool down is the card deck. And it's different automated variability. And I think that It's just funny because back when I was in college, I would have thought nothing of the variability. Because again, my mind was so just structured, sets, reps, what's the ultimate training structure? In reality, doing the card deck of push-ups with your buddies is fun. Like there's something, and the variability is just built in. It's like you're kind of combining elements. And for me, I would have really needed those things to take away my strategizing brain for that. Just where that was my go-to. So yeah, I know this past winter I did a lot of work, and I'm looking forward to doing it this next winter. Is a lot of my training would be with a sandbag, and then with the card deck, and it was really, really good. I mean, especially 2 days where I wasn't really necessarily feeling it, where the goal, and I think too, that's the thing, is if you're going into a workout and you aren't feeling amazing, then in a typical situation, you warm up typically, you're like, all right, I'm not feeling amazing, still not feeling amazing. You go through, there's a judgment-based feedback loop for whatever the first sprint or activity you do is. Oh, it wasn't very good. And there's really no way to win that workout. Whereas if you go into, the card deck is more like a play-based, where there's not the judgment feedback loop. There is a little bit of steady cardio that's kind of helping helps your body both engage and recover. And by the end of that, you might actually feel pretty darn good, the same way as if you weren't feeling great and you went and played a game of pickup basketball or something, or spike ball. And so I think there's something with the card deck as well, with like the judgment-based feedback loop. Once you take that offline, I think that can give you a really good and positive experience. And that kind of idea, I think you could plug into whatever you're doing. It could be weights, probably could even be ISOs on a level. I'd be curious what your thoughts would be with doing that with ISOs. ISOs, I think, is a little bit different, but yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that with like how would you arrange that in different ways, or with ISOs in mind?
With specific to the cards, or just variability?
Yeah, variability, cards, like anything like that. Like holding, doing the long ISO hold.
The way that I do the isometrics, though, is like my screening eval is essentially for them to identify which muscles they don't have control over. And so whatever muscles they can't contract just by sitting in a chair, that's then how I base the isometrics. And sometimes, so like a common one is that people aren't able to engage their outside of their hamstring. The outside of the hamstring is the bicep femoris. That typically kicks on when the foot is slightly externally rotated and you get more pressure on the outside of the foot. That's usually when it first engages. And so then for an isometric lunge, the variability might be, okay, for this first rep, you're going to externally rotate your foot and you're going to squeeze your pinky toe or push your pinky side, down into the ground, activate that outside hamstring. And then maybe the next rep, you're going to do it normal. And then now you're going to keep blending the two of rotating the foot out, going back to neutral, rotating the foot out. Or maybe you work at various degrees where it's, okay, turn your foot out as far as you can. Okay, I can engage my hamstring. Now you're going to put it in. You're going to go, degree by degree back towards the midline. As soon as you feel like you lose the control over the outer hamstring, then that's when you're going to stop there. And then now you're going to do a 5-minute isometric there. So a lot of what I would do there is more of brain body awareness of, okay, exactly figuring out at what joint angle, what position do I now lose the brain body connection over that muscle. And then now that's what we're going to focus on. And I always try and tailor that to gait. So however the muscles would fire during a normal gait of walking, one side is going to be flexing, one side is going to be extending. And so that's how I'd also tailor those isometrics off. And, if you want to do card games, you could do card games and flip up certain thing. And okay, this one, you hold for X amount of time, or maybe this one it's reps. You're doing
like
reps, and this one you're doing holds. Yeah, but that's more how I would approach the isometrics, and I would even do that into the shock training too. Though, okay, now if we're doing shock training, you're going to change these slight different angles to get that same result, and you get the same thing too when you. Even on the perception action, one of the things that we would use, which I think is a great idea, is either if you tie like flags or a clothespin. The clothespin I learned from Brett, but if you have an athlete who, let's say, came off of a knee injury and you're working on some grappling work or you're working on some mat work, and you put a clothespin on their around their knee, and you're saying, okay, don't allow the other opponent to grab that clothespin. Now you're creating a lot of awareness around that knee, because now they're rotating around, they're somersaulting, they're being thrown on their back, and they're being put in all these various positions, and they have to learn how to essentially control that knee. Or it might be vice versa. You put it somewhere not even near the knee, and then you have them do the same thing and work with that. You can even do like reflex points. So the knee and the opposite elbow are going to be connected. And so you can put it on the opposite elbow, because if you have dysfunction in, let's say, the right knee, you're most likely going to have a little bit of dysfunction in the left elbow. So you could do that. Even things with same side hamstring and tricep work. So let's say somebody's shoulder was bothering them, or they had pec tightness, like you could work where it's back behind their tricep or their hamstring, and that's going to then create awareness to those areas as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting with doing that. Yeah, the clothespin and awareness. When you were talking about the ISOs too, I was thinking about, I've seen he's like kind of a Wim Hof breath hold type instructor. He had a video on the horse stance isometric, and he was talking about using a timer. I actually downloaded this. I just call it Capricious Timer on my phone, but it gives you like a window where you don't know how long you're going to hold the ISO, and you could set the timer. All right, you're going to hold it somewhere between 1:30 and 4 minutes or something like that. And apparently, I think he had said that he had good luck with that actually helping him to be able to set records in the holds, because I don't know, it's something to do with your brain, and you can always hold 10 more seconds, and there's maybe that level of uncertainty with it, or maybe it's present moment or present minded type piece. But I think the card deck would be interesting too, doing like holds or like a bounce hold or going through reps of the motion. It definitely could be a really interesting thing. I was even just thinking too, for sprinting, it would be interesting if it was track, like something that's common is like a 23-second run. It would be an interesting practice, almost to like warm up for that, where maybe you just have people race like groups of 3, and they didn't know how far they were going to go, and then when you blew the whistle, they were done or something like that. And it could be 100 meters, it could be 150, it could be 300. It'd be interesting to play around with, just to just emotionally teaching people to race. This is where my mind, of course, goes with these things. I do have one last little question here. I know our time's kind of running out, but we've talked about this before, Jarod, but the idea of how athletes move in one environment versus another. So for example, an athlete who maybe they move really well if they're just playing, it's a play-based environment and they move well, but then as soon as it's coached or maybe they're competing, they really start to struggle. I'm curious what your take is on how athletes move and are able to compete in different environments if they really struggle in like practice versus a game or those types of situations. Any consideration with the layers that go into that and trying to help bring out like a more pure form of movement?
So great question you bring up, and because that shows you where the showcase people are versus the actual athletes, to say. And like in baseball, we would see, one of the things for recruiting videos is that they want everything to look pretty, make sure, okay, hit me a ball up the middle, show me a pretty low backhand. Okay, I'm going to charge on this one. And then when you hit, you're making sure the ball is always in this specific spot so that I get the best exit velo, et cetera, et cetera. But then as soon as you put them in an environment where they're doing rundowns or they're catching a football, it's like all of a sudden their times just dramatically drop. Like as soon as you bring in these external focuses, they can no longer run as fast. And then you find these athletes who do differently with their showcase, it might be okay, but then as soon as you get them into like a skill game or something like that, all of a sudden they become the best player. It's just their ability to like pass and coordinate how the players are on the field, or their ability to run and track something down. Like they would just run so much faster. And so I think that's that's one of the cool things that you can recognize. So then you can also then work with those athletes. Now you realize that, okay, so yeah, maybe this guy's in a showcase guy, but look what he can do when we play a game. And if this guy is more of a showcase guy, then you know that you have a lot more work to do with the perception action. I mean, I couldn't tell you the amount of times that we would have like a guy who run a flying 10 and it'd be sub 1 second. And you're looking at him and you're like, what? Like how, like that looked terrible. Like, and also you can't, like, he's so stiff and he can't move. Like, how did he just do that? And so that was one of the things that we learned, is just that putting those people in those environments, you learned who the gamers were and you learned who the showcase people were.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely makes sense. And yeah, the more that I've been around, especially the different ends of sport, getting into more youth sport coaching now, you see just how different it is with like a child running in a game where they might be nervous or anxious or not know what to do when like someone stops them playing soccer, versus then I'll watch like my children just run on the sidewalk and they run so much faster and more easily and fluidly, versus that the lag that they're trying to process the game. And of course they'll get better as they get older, but you always think about the pieces of that still might be there, and where hangups do arise in processing your environment from a lot of different perspectives. So,
yeah. Well, I think that's where it's important too. Like a lot of parents always try and have their players or their kids like play up. And I do think there's something to that, because when they're playing up, just as you mentioned, that there's more experience, there's more variability, like there's situations the players have been more present in. And so that's going to further upgrade their output. And I saw personally experienced this with sprinting. Like I'm not a fast person at all. And when I do like training sessions with Brett, like he is very fast. And there will be times where we're racing and we'll look at the GPS data, and there's times where his top speed for the day is capped essentially based upon me, where because I was running slower than him, now he's not running and 20 miles per hour, he's running 16, 17, and I'm running 16, 17. And then there's other times where I would have thought I would never be able to run faster than that. And then all of a sudden I hit, 19 miles per hour. And I'm like, how is that even possible? And it's like, well, I'm working with 3 guys right now who are way faster than me. And it forces you to run faster. And you're like, well, I never ran that fast, but all the data shows that, the sprints were much faster. So there is something to that of understanding, the competition and making sure that, you're with people who are better than you, you're with people who are not as good as you. And you're also working with people who are at your level as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I know, Jarod, our time's finished up here, but do you have any closing thoughts before we get out of here for the day?
No, I appreciate you bringing me back on, and I enjoy it. And like always, I'm very appreciative of your podcast. That is part of what started my curiosity and all the strength and conditioning. So I'm very appreciative.
Yeah. Well, you're welcome. And thank you for being on again. It was great chatting today. Appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you listening, and I'll see you next week.